All right, welcome to Week 14 Forum. This week again, we are investigating race, ethnicity, and gender. Most of you probably think of these categories as pretty hard and fast, but as social scientists, we tend to think of these terms as socially constructed. What does that mean? What are the implications of thinking of categories like race, ethnicity, and gender as more fluid and subject to negotiation than sort of people who don't study this stuff for a living tend to approach them? Part of the reason social scientists think of race and ethnicity as socially constructed is the mass of ethnographic data challenging the notions of purity as it relates to both race and ethnicity. I mentioned in a recent forum that I just finished reading a great book by James C. Scott called The Art of Not Being Governed. And the basic thesis of the book is that groups of people exist adjacent to these civilizations in Southeast Asia that are not particularly interested in being civilized, which is another way of saying being taxed or having their labor conscripted, and to a greater or lesser extent just walk away into mountainous and heavily jungled parts of Southeast Asia that's alternatively called the Asian Matif or Zomia. Again, it's a region that's largely been beyond the reach of what Scott describes as lowland populations. Um, Scott's study of the ethnographic, data, studies of the region suggests that there's been so much movement in and out of this region, and so many drifts of ethnic and religious and identity groupings that the very notion of groups like the Hmong or the Karen as distinctively pure is frankly implausible. This is sort of a long way of saying that categories like race and ethnicity are not biologically determined. It's not, I mean, if you're a Nazi, you think that way, but for most people, it just doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. So how is that this ethnicity distinct from race? We have this tendency again to social construct our own identities, as I mentioned in the chapter on identity. I am ethnically speaking and racially to some to a great extent a mutt, as many of us are. I have a vast amount of genetic material flowing through me, but it makes sense for me to consider myself an Irish American because my grandfather on my mother's side was from Ireland, and my genetic grandmother on my father's side is pure Welsh, so I have a lot of Gaelic in me. But for this chapter, why do we use ethnic and racial and gender categories, if not to discriminate, which is often sort of the problem. And that's something that Scott talks about in his book, that the minute you start talking about identity, often you're basically talking about people that you're not in control of, that you want to control. So what causes us to think of a person being African or Arabic or Indian or Han? And why does that somehow condition our expectations about their cognitive capacities, for example? With gender, again, we must confront the reality that differences exist between the idea of biological sex, which refers to the role of gender in the reproductive process, and gender itself, which again is heavily subject to social construction. I mentioned in my other class the ubiquity of gender discrimination and subordination of women across civilizational boundaries. And again, I referenced the book I mentioned above by Scott, which he suggests that some highland ethnic groups that adopted radical strategies of withdrawal also tended to be far more egalitarian and at times matrilineal in their modes of social organization, which could lead us to the conclusion that more primitive modes of social organization are somehow better as far as gender equality. And I would hesitate, I would caution before jumping to that conclusion. I do believe that all civilizations can certainly improve on gender equality, and I don't think that primitive necessarily translates to gender, egalitarian. It's far more complicated than that. Why do we tend to think of heterosexuality as the norm? Why does heteronormativity, which is a word that they use in the text, tend to produce also discrimination? I consider myself to be heterosexual, but I have, by this time in my life, really no inclination to discriminate against people who don't share my sexual orientation. I'm frankly not interested. But I can remember a time when I probably did embrace more discriminatory viewpoints when I was young and ignorant. It's certainly not something I'm proud of. What do you suppose inspires people to adopt discriminatory attitudes towards people who are part of I mean, I should say straight people who are part, towards people who are part of the LGBTQ community? I think it makes sense to focus on the cause and effect section of this chapter for the remainder of our little mini lecture here. That explores the factors that can influence representation of women and minority groups. The authors discuss the importance of symbolism as a basis for empowerment. What do social scientists mean when they talk about the idea of symbolic empowerment? Why is it so important that Barack Obama was the first African American president? Why are symbols so important when we think about ensuring that previously discriminated against groups and ethnic minorities and women are treated in a more equitable manner? How does symbolism help us with that? When we think of gender equality, why has the United States not yet had a female president? Why is it that the Republic of Mauritius, a West African country, and Pakistan had female heads of state, but not the United States? What factors prevent that? We have also mentioned the power of social movements to secure change. What role do social movements play in different countries in seeking racial, ethnic, or gender equality? I mentioned Evo Morales of Bolivia in the little overview. Part of the reason why he's had such a hold on power is that he was a leader of a major outgroup, and that movement has gone a long way towards kind of retaining the cohesiveness of the constituency that he needs in order to win elections. We can discuss the United States, of course, and its various civil rights movements, but again, for this class, we should be looking to other countries where similar kinds of discrimination exists. There are some really inspiring stories out there that are in the text that we can talk about. I think the author's discussion of the rise of ethnic political parties is really interesting. What are some factors that allow for the formation of ethnic minority parties? What are some factors that what are some of the reasons and examples that you find particularly interesting? Why has the United States not formed, an ethnic political party? Why have African Americans, invested their fortunes alternatively in the Republican Party up to the 1940s and the Democratic Party since? What do the laws governing elections contribute to party formation that either, allow or inhibit the formation of ethnic or racial minority parties? The authors discuss the idea of quota systems as a way for political regimes to right previous wrongs inflicted on stigmatized groups. Most Americans instinctively cringe at the notion of quotas across the ideological spectrum. Americans, kind of from a cultural perspective, want to be treated as individuals, and in our law, quotas have actually been rejected, especially in terms of allowing women and minorities access to social goods like higher education. What do you think about the prospect of quotas as a basis for ensuring, racial, ethnic, and gender empowerment? Look at the examples of such quotas that the authors point to. I think the thinking comparatively section that talks about gender empowerment based on colonial experience, whether countries were former British or Spanish colonies. What do you make of the finding that women living in former British colonies are better off on economic and political indicators, but women in former Spanish colonies have more women represented in political institutions? What is the significance of that? I think that there are a number of cases in context for this chapter that are really interesting. You can learn about how women are doing in post-revolutionary Iran, or the challenges associated with gender empowerment in Japan, or the progress Brazil has made in expanding gender and political representation, or why Mexico has failed to develop ethnically oriented political parties for its mestizo population, who have consistently suffered discrimination, while India has managed successfully to develop ethnic political parties. All these issues are, to me, absolutely fascinating, and something that I think that we could probably have a good time talking about. Our country for profiling this week is India, which, like China, is an absolutely massive civilization with a huge and deep history, and that embodies so many paradoxes. India has managed, despite its caste system and Asian, typical Asian resistance to democracy, to nevertheless develop into the largest democratic nation state in the world. Its history since independence only dates back to 1947, but even that brief history is incredibly complex and rich in detail. Obviously, I'm not asking you to become an expert on India in 1 week, but I do think we need to work on becoming more familiar with its political system, and in particular those aspects of its political system that stand out as unique. Currently, the right-wing nationalists Bharatiya Janata Party and its leader Narendra Modi are in power. The party formed in reaction to Indira Gandhi's declaration of the state of emergency in 1975. Its platform of Hindutva espouses Indian nationalism, favoring Hindu culture over Westernization, and it is predictably deeply nativist and hostile to immigrants, or what they call illegal immigrants. The BJP also advocates something similar to kind of a made in India argument for part of its economic policy. In terms of its government, India, not surprisingly, separates its head of state and head of government. Its president is Ram Nath Kovind, who is a former BJP member. Its legislature is bicameral. Its upper chamber is the Rajya Sabha, the Council of States, which has 245 members elected to staggered 6-year terms. The 545 members of the Lok Sabha are elected from single-member districts to 5-year terms. They have a Westminster style of government, which means that the upper chamber does not have the same kind of power and influence. They have parliamentary sovereignty. They have a tiered judiciary system that does enjoy the power of judicial review. What are you seeing, in terms of in my view, you see a constitutional regime that draws on elements of both American constitutionalism overlaid over a strongly British political and British political and legal tradition. So what is it about the Indian government or political culture that you find really interesting? What about India do you find hard to understand? If there's anything about Chapter 14 or the profile on India, let's talk about it in the profile and clear it out. Also, if there's anything in current events that strike you as particularly telling about either Chapter 14 or India, again, let's talk about it, and let's have a great week of discussion.